So in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the ways that you can modify your selections and things that you can do that maybe aren't completely obvious. And one of the first things I want to talk about using our wand tester riff file from our last lesson, which is in the chapter 9 work files, is I want to see how we can take what's on our canvas and move it onto a layer. Now, if we go ahead and context click on that canvas, you'll see that there's no way that we can duplicate this. It's currently grayed out. And this becomes sort of a frustrating thing for people who are used to working in a program like Photoshop, where it's very easy to duplicate your canvas. So the way that we do this is we use the Control-A keyboard shortcut, which is going to select everything. Now, if we come up here to the Select menu, you'll see that right at the very top, it's Select All, and it's Control-A. Now, right under that is another command that I usually use the keyboard for, which is the Select None or Deselect, and that is Control-D. And then underneath that is the invert selection, basically meaning that whatever we have selected, select the opposite, and that is Control-I. Now, generally speaking, these ones you pretty much almost always want to use right off the keyboard. They're things that you're going to use all the time, and I highly recommend that you memorize these keyboard shortcuts, particularly the first two. Now, we want to take this canvas and we want to move it onto a layer so that we can work with it like any other layer. And the way that we do that is we choose the Layer Adjuster tool, and then we simply double click. And you can see immediately that that has been floated onto its own layer 1. And now, if we go ahead and context click on that layer 1, you can see that we can duplicate this and do whatever we want to. Now, that also works with layer content as well. So if we come over here and we go ahead and choose something like this rectangular selection that I've got right here, then we can float that. Now, we could use the layer adjuster by simply going and clicking on that once, and now you can see that we have what's known as a layer floating object sublayer. It's, as you can see, slightly offset from that layer 1 copy that we made, and you can see that it has a totally different icon. Now, if we context click on that, you can see that we have delete and we have select layer content. Now, what does it mean, select layer content? Well, if we go ahead and turn off the visibility on everything else but it, you can see that we have transparency in this little sub layer floating object, and that transparency can be selected and then used to fill in whatever way that we want to. So that's what it means when it says select layer content. Now, basically the idea with the floating layer is that we can do whatever we want to with it, just moving our floating objects around. And of course, the reason why you still see that is because we had layer 1 underneath, so I turned the visibility of that off. But we can move this around whichever way we want to. And as long as we're on this layer floating object, we can work with that floating object to our heart's content. However, once we're done, we simply just click on any of these other layers, it doesn't matter which one, and that will instantly go away, and it's no longer a floating object. Now, if we come in here with something like our rectangular marquee again, and we make another selection, something like so, we can come up to the select menu, and down here you'll see right here under this category is the float command. And the float command does exactly the same thing as clicking it with the layer adjuster tool. It creates a sub layer floating object layer. I don't really even know how to describe this. The basic concept of floating objects is this. Before Painter had layers, back in the old days, it had floaters, and floaters were sort of kind of like layers, and they were sort of the way that Painter used to work. When they introduced layers into Painter, they didn't get rid of the floating objects. They simply made them these sort of sub-objects of layers. So that can be a little confusing to people who are used to the Photoshop way of doing things. However, there are some advantages of using these floating objects, and if you need them, they're there for you. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on layer 1, and then I'm simply going to go ahead and delete that layer 1 because we don't need that example anymore. As a matter of fact, we don't need this whole file anymore. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this file by clicking on the X and saying no to save changes. And behind that, I have a brand new file open. Now what I want to do is I want to show you how to make some modifications to the selections themselves. So if I just go ahead and make a rectangular selection like so, and I go up to the select menu, you'll see down here that we have a couple of options here that will allow us to modify these selections. Now, we have this little sub menu here for widen, contract, smooth, border, and then we also have this feather command. Now, the feather command is basically like a super anti-alias. So we'll come back to that one in just one second, but at the beginning here, I want to look at smoothing the border. So if I click smooth, you'll see that the outside edge of this selection has been rounded. If I do that again, select, modify, smooth, it'll be rounded a little bit more. If I do that again, select, modify, smooth, you can see that we end up with this fairly round corner for our selection. Now, if I choose our paint bucket and I fill, you can see that now we have this nice rounded edge, and I'll just hit Control D to deselect, and you can see that we have this nice rounded edge. Now, if I come over here and I make a similar size selection, like so, and let's say that I want to use the feather command. So I come up here and I say Select, Feather. Now the feather command is going to do an awful lot of the same type of thing. Now, chances are you're going to see a lower value by default, but I want you to go ahead and put in something like, say, 10 to start. And this will give us a nice rounded looking edge of our selection. So I'll hit OK. Immediately you might think, oh, well, that looks an awful lot like the smooth command, except we didn't have to do it multiple times. Well, in its selection form, it does look like that. However, when we go to fill it, it'll become really obvious to you what I mean when I say it's like a super anti-alias. So there we go. You can see very clearly that we end up with this very blurred out edge, this very, very soft edge. And the higher you set the feather value, the more blurred out that edge will become. So obviously the smooth and the feather are not the same type of thing. They're really very different, even though in selection mode, they look very similar. Now, if I use the spacebar and I move over like so, and I make another rectangular selection like so, we can go up here to the select and we can choose modify and we can choose border. And what border is going to allow us to do is to specify a border from the selection outward of how many ever pixels. So in this instance, 10 pixels will be just fine for me. I'm going to hit OK. And you can see that now we have a border of 10 pixels. And if I fill that, you can see very clearly that that is the border that we have. Now, if I deselect that and I make another rectangular selection, and we come up here and we choose, well, actually, before I do that, let me go ahead and just fill this so that this will be a little bit more obvious to you. Now, if we come down here to select, modify, widen. Basically, if we widen this by 10 pixels, we'll end up with something that looks somewhat similar to what we had with our border, except it'll all be fillable. So if I click this, everything is now black. Now, if I select, modify, and contract is basically the exact opposite of widen. And so now I'm just going to enter something like, say, 15 pixels, and I'm going to hit OK. And now you're going to see that that selection has shrunk itself back down by 15 pixels in every direction. And if I flip to white and I fill that, you can see that now we effectively have something similar to border, except we had to do that in 2 steps, whereas border, we only had to do that in 1 step. The other difference is that we can go out however many pixels we want to, and we can come in how many ever pixels we want to. Another interesting thing that you can do with this technique sometimes, which might come in handy for you, is let me just use the spacebar, and I'm going to scroll over here to a blank area of the canvas. And now I'm going to go ahead and click and drag, create my marquee, and then just fill it with our paint bucket, like so. And then I'm going to go up here and I'm going to choose something like our select, modify, and contract. And again, we'll just use 15 pixels. That'll be fine for what we're trying to do. And now I'm going to use our layer adjuster, which is this selection adjuster right here. And I can just simply use the keyboard once I'm in that, and I can nudge this selection wherever I'd like it to be. So let's say I want an offset border here. Well, this is something that we couldn't do with that border tool. Now, if I fill it with white, you can see that we end up with a much more interesting type of offset border versus that even weight border all the way around. So certainly some things that you can do when you're adjusting your selections for very different results. And of course, like I say, that little trick with floating the canvas into a layer is something that you don't want to forget. Remember, select all and then use the layer adjuster tool. Just tap it and it'll pop right up to its own layer. So it's very quick and easy.